Today I want to look at a question that comes up often and the solution is not difficult. It's how to restrict trading to time ranges. I'll show you how to implement time ranges using the EA framework and then using a standalone class. I'll be using framework version 2.03 for this. You can download the latest version of the framework from our website and there will be a link in the description. I won't be going into any detail on how the framework works. If you're interested, I will also leave a link in the description and on screen to a playlist where you can go through the complete development of the framework. I'll start with installing the latest framework, then how to upgrade if you already have an earlier version installed, then adding time ranges to the framework, and I'll finish with the standalone class and a demonstration. In case you want to skip over part of the video, there will be chapter markers in the description and across the bottom of the video. So let's start with installing the framework on a clean installation. I've already downloaded here. This is in my downloads folder, and here's the framework that I've downloaded, eaframework.zip. If you can't see this is .zip extension, then you can just go to View and click on File Name Extensions here, and that will show it. So first thing I want to do is extract the files from that zip file. So I right click, select Extract All, run that extract. And now here's the folder that's been created, EA Framework. If I go into that, it will include experts and include, there's a README here with some instructions for installation and an index.txt file that shows which files have been included in the download. And in the experts, there's an orchard folder, and in the include, there's also an orchard folder. So now before we go further, I need to open the matching folder in MetaTrader 4. And the easiest way to get to that is to go to your MetaTrader 4 instance and select File, Open Data Folder. I'll just line those up side by side. The instruction is the same for MetaTrader 5. You still go to File, Open Data Folder, although your folder will look slightly different. In MetaTrader 4 there is this MQL4 folder, so we'll go into there. In MetaTrader 5 that would have been an MQL5 folder. And now in experts, I've already created a folder called Orchard. If you don't have one, then create it. We'll go into there. And now if I go to the experts from the EA framework, add into Orchard, here is Framework EA. And this includes a number of sample and example files. So I'm just going to copy that completely from the download into Experts Orchard in MetaTrader. Now I'll go back up to the MQL4 folder, and this time I'll go into Include. And again, I've already created a folder called Orchard, but if you haven't got one, then just create that. And back to my framework, Include Orchard, and here is the frameworks folder. And just as with the experts, I'll simply copy that to the Include Orchard folder. After that's done, you should go into that frameworks folder in the include, and there is this make extension mqh.bat file. That will rebuild a number of MQH files to match your installation. So I'm just going to run that. And you should get messages like this, built include file, and then finished. So that's done. And now the framework here is pointing at the latest version of the framework, which in this case is framework 2.03. Once I've done that, I can close these and go back into MetaTrader 4 or MetaTrader 5. And then if I select the MetaQuotes language editor, under experts, I can see I have Orchard, Framework EA with the templates and example files. And if I look at the include folder, I also have Orchard, frameworks, with all the frameworks from 1 up to 2.03 at the moment, along with some example extensions. The framework.mqh file here, simply loading in the latest version framework 2.03. And there we have the framework 2.03, which in turn loads all of the rest of the files from framework 2.03. Now that was for a new installation. If you already have the framework installed, then as long as you haven't modified any of the files that are supplied with the framework, you can do the same thing. But I'll just simulate a framework that is already installed and we're upgrading to a newer version. So to simulate that, I'm going to go into the frameworks and I'm just going to delete the 2.03. I can either copy everything from this frameworks folder, and I'll get a warning prompt from Windows that there are files with the same name. Do I want to overwrite them? And if I haven't modified anything from the framework here, I can do that, and that's the easiest way. So to do that, I would just go here and copy frameworks, and then I get this destination has 60 files at the moment, and I would just select replace files in the destination. And I would do the same with the experts then. And this framework EA, I can just copy all of that. And again, I'll get a replace files. And as long as I haven't been modifying the files, I can replace them. And now I have the latest version of the framework. Just as before though, in the include folder, frameworks, run make extension mqh.bat just to make sure that everything's up to date. If you have made modifications or you're concerned, then an alternate approach will be to monitor the files that you're copying. So here in frameworks, I already have the earlier versions up to 2.02. All I want to do is add 2.03. That doesn't exist in my current installation, so I can just copy that in. And now I have the latest version framework. The only thing to think about then is whether any of the sample files in the extensions have been modified. And if you want to simply copy the extensions file across, then you can click this let me decide for each file, and that will show you that each file is, in my case, the same size, but it will highlight any that have changed. And then you can make a decision whether they're changed because you've made some modifications or not, and choose to overwrite them if you wish. But by far the easiest method is not to modify any files in the framework or the examples that are supplied, and then just copy the entire framework folder over the top of the folder you already have. Run make extension mqh.bat, and then everything is up to date. Now, today's tutorial is about implementing a time trading range. And I'm going to implement that as a strategy inside the framework. So if I go into include orchard frameworks, here's my framework 2.03, but what I'm looking at is extensions. And in extensions I have signals, and there is a signal template file provided, which you can use to create a new signal file. Normally a signal requires some indicators to be added in, but for the time range there is no signal, so I can do everything inside a template. So first thing I want to do is make a copy of this signal template file in here, and I'm going to call that signal time range. And perhaps the simplest way to do that, if I just open it and then choose File, Save As, and I'll just change the name to signal time range and save. So now the modifications. First I'm going to change the heading in the comments. This is all fine because I've left everything in the default location. So this include /2 framework.mqh will pull in the rest of the framework. I need to change the class name from csignal template to csignal time range. And I'm still inheriting from csignal base. Now I'm going to be capturing the start and end times as start hour, start minute, end hour, and end minute. So I'll create some member variables for those to begin with. And these are integers because the hour is only from 0 to 23 and the minute is 0 to 59. I also want to allow this to check whether I'm inside the time range, or I might be using the time range as an exclude time range. So I'll just create a Boolean here, which I'm calling check inside, and that will tell me, do I want to check if the time is inside the time range, or do I want to check if the time is outside the time range? And then I'm going to calculate an actual start and end time just in minutes. So I just create two variables for that. And these are also integer variables, so start time and end time. And I'm going to create a function to actually do the time comparisons for me here, so I'll declare that. I'm just going to call that inside range, and that will return a Boolean telling me if I'm inside the time range or outside the time range. Now, constructors. This is the default left over from the template. I'm just going to replace that. So my default constructor, csignal time range, I'm passing in a starting hour, a starting minute, ending hour and ending minute, and then this boolean that I created, am I checking inside? I'm defaulting that to true because in most cases it will be true, so I won't need to supply it if this should be true. And then I'm calling csignal base, which is the base class with no parameters, and then I'm calling the init method, passing through that start hour, minute, end hour, and end minute, and the check inside value. And I'll do the same for this second constructor. The only difference between the first and the second constructor is that this one takes the symbol and the time frame. The first constructor will default to the current chart symbol and time frame. This one allows you to specify a symbol and time frame. I always create this, although I almost never use it. And then calling the signal base and passing through that symbol and time frame, there are no differences between these two constructors. And then I just need to make sure that my init method handles the correct arguments. So it's taking the same arguments, starting hour, minute, ending minute, and the check inside value. And then an update signal method. It's already here in the template. I won't need to make any changes there. I'll actually implement the changes in the update signal method below. Now the init method. I'm just going to replace this entire template with the function. So let me override that. So here, csignal time range init, same arguments we've seen already. This line, which I put into all of the init statements, tests to see if the initialization of any parent classes has already failed, because each parent class above will set the init result value to be a failure if it has failed. So if I check that at the beginning here, then I can just exit this quickly and I don't need to waste time doing any further work. So a simple test, if init result, and that's a function defined in the common base class, if that's not a successful initialization, then I just return that value from this function. And now I'm doing some parameter checking. I'm checking that the 0 is less than or equal to the start hour, and that the start hour is less than or equal to 23. And then I'm doing the same thing for minutes. 0 is less than or equal to the start minute, and the start minute is less than or equal to 59. And of course doing the same thing for the end hour and end minute, just to make sure I don't get any invalid times being passed in. And if any of those fail, simple error message being returned using this init error function. This is also defined in the common base class, and I'm returning init failed. Assuming all of those pass, then the check inside value, I'm saving that in the member variable, and then I'm assigning the start hour and minute, end hour and end minute to their appropriate member variables. But then I'm calculating the start time and end time that I mentioned earlier, and that's just hours by 60 plus minute. And that gives me a single number for the start time and a single number for the end time that I can compare easily, rather than have to worry about whether the hour is the same and then comparing the minutes separately. And since nothing could go wrong in here, I just return init succeeded then. And now the update signal, this is the method that's there from the template. I'll just replace these lines. So first thing I'm going to do is create a variable, a boolean called inside range, and I'm going to call the inside range function, which we defined earlier. There. I haven't written that yet, but I will in a moment. But that's simply going to tell me whether the current time is within the range specified. And then here, this is looking at that check inside. So if not check inside, then I'm simply reversing the inside range. And then using this variable, if I'm inside the range, then the entry signal is both, because this particular signal isn't saying whether you need to buy or sell, it's just saying can you trade. So I'm setting the signal to both. And if we're not inside the range, then I'm setting the signal to none. And again, because this signal isn't telling me whether I'm doing entry or exit, I may be using this to monitor whether I want to exit trades. I'm just assigning the entry signal value to the exit signal value, so they're both the same at the end of this. And then the inside range function, this is where all the real work happens. If the start time is the same as the end time, then I'm just returning true. And this is the way to disable this function. If you simply say I'm starting at midnight and ending at midnight or any other time, if the two of them are the same, then this is always going to return true. Then I'm declaring a variable of type MQL date time. This is a structure which breaks down times into their component parts, hours, minutes, days, and so on. And then by calling time current and passing in that value, it will populate the MQL now variable with the current server time. And then I'm simply creating this variable integer type now, and here again I'm multiplying the hours by 60 and adding the minutes. So that means the variable now will contain a single number, which is number of minutes into the current day, and I can use that to compare to the start time and end time. I need to make two comparisons. Because markets trade 24 hours a day, start time could be toward the end of the day and end time could be at the beginning. So if you wanted to set this range between, say, 2200 and 0200, then end time would be less than start time. So the first check is the common case that most people think of. If the start time is less than the end time, which means we're ending later in the day than we're starting, then I'm simply saying if the start time is less than or equal to now, and now is less than or equal to the end time, and then I'm incorporating the second case, or. If the end time is earlier than the start time, then it means that we're looking at a time that's crossing midnight. And in that case, this AND condition and then the next part inside parentheses, if now is after or equal to the start time, or it's before or equal to the end time, which is a less common case, but if that's happening and end time is before start time, then that's also a true value for being inside range. So thinking about this second case, if end time is less than start time, it means that I'm inside the range if now is at the beginning of the day, so I haven't reached the end time, or it's at the end of the day, so I'm already past the start time. And that's the complete inside range function. So now that completes the signal time range class. Let me just compile to make sure I haven't made a typing error. Okay. So now that I can see this signal time range can compile, I need to run that make MQH just to include this in the framework. And the easiest way to get to that, if I go here to frameworks, so Orchard Frameworks, right click there, open folder, and that will open Windows Explorer in that frameworks folder, and there's the make extension mqh.bat. I just run that. I can see that I have the results there. That's worked. I can now close this. And what that will do, it updates the all extensions, all indicators, all signals, and all take profit stop loss. And in fact, if I create additional folders in here, it will create more of these MQH files to match those folders. And because we added a new signal, if I open this all signals, we can now see that I have this signal time range in here. So that will now be part of the framework for any EA that might load it. And all I need now is to incorporate that signal inside an expert. Now, to show how this is being used, or how it can be used, I've already created an expert, which I'm now calling MA crossover time range. I've created this by copying the template files here that are supplied with the framework. And I've already implemented all of the code for a very simple moving average crossover. In fact, it's a copy of the code that we built up earlier in the MA crossover here, and that is also supplied with the framework. So just to save time, I've already implemented all of that. What I'm going to do is add the code to implement the time range. So the MQ4 file, there's very little in here. There's the comment, these properties, and then it includes the MA crossover. Sorry, typing mistake there. The MA crossover time range.mqh file, this MQH file here. The time range MQ5, very similar, same typing mistake there. Comments, properties, the include statement, and then a small number of functions that don't occur in MetaTrader 4. But other than that, there's very little in the MA crossover, and this is an almost exact copy of the template. The only thing that I've changed here has been the name of the include file and these comments, and that's the same for the MQ4 version. So all the real work happens inside the MQH file. So I've already created this, as I said. I've changed the name in the comments. This line is already common, include the Orchard Frameworks framework.mqh. That will bring in the most recent framework, and this has been built using framework 2.03. Now the inputs, these are standard inputs from the moving average cross example, so we're just getting the fast periods and the slow periods and the method and so on. But then I need to get the values for the time trading range. So I'm going to be inclusive of the start and finish times, and I'm explaining if we start at 14:25 and go to 14:30, then any time greater than or equal to 14:25 and less than or equal to 14:30. I'm not including an input for inclusion or exclusion of the range. That's a fairly simple change you can make if you wish. And by default, I'm setting the start hour, minute, end hour, and minute to 0, which, as we saw in the signal file, will mean that it simply won't check and will return true always. So you change these as needed. And then standard inputs, I put in all of my expert advisors, so change the comment and the magic number as you need. Here is where I'm creating an expert object or declaring a variable of type C expert, so I can create that later. These are the fast and slow indicators for the moving average and the crossover class, which I'm going to be using to compare moving average cross. Now I just need to add a signal for the time range. So we created C signal time range earlier, and I'm just creating a variable that's named signal time range. Everything here is either standard or I've copied it from the MA crossover. I'm creating an expert variable. I'm setting the volume, trade comment, and magic number on that expert. I'm creating my fast and slow indicator buffers using the C indicator MA class. Then I'm creating the crossover class, and I'm adding the fast and then the slow indicator to that. And we've seen all of that before in the MA crossover tutorial. But now I want to create my signal time range. So I'm simply creating that, and this has more arguments. You'll see the signal crossover has no arguments, but the constructor for the time range has the start hour, minute, the end hour, and the end minute. And then to apply these signals to an expert, we simply call this add entry signal method. So I'm already adding the crossover signal, and the exit from this particular strategy also uses the crossover in the opposite direction. But I need to add in the time range. So I'm adding a second signal, which is the signal time range. And by default, both of these must be true for a trade to happen. So it must not only be a crossover occurring, it must occur within the time range. The time range is not applicable for the exit signals for this, so I just haven't bothered to add it there. With all of that done, the only thing left is to clean up when we finish the expert advisor. And so I just need to delete that signal time range variable. And everything else here is done. So now if I go back here to the MQ4 file, I'll just compile that, and that has worked. I'll have to open up MT5 to compile the MQ5 file, but for now, let's just run the example with the MQ4 file. So I've set up the strategy tester for a demonstration, and I've chosen a time range where I know I'll get trades that I can use. If I look at the expert properties, I currently have start hour, minute, end hour, and end minute to 0, which means that it won't run any testing. So I will just start this. And what we can see here, I've executed a buy because there's been a moving average cross, and that's in time 10 on the 20th of May. And if I let that run, and now that closed at 0700 on the 21st of May. And at the same time, because this is a moving average cross, the cross went the opposite direction and opened a sell trade. So I'll stop that, go back to my expert properties, and I'll set a time range with the start hour of 9 and the end hour of 22. So that first trade that happened at 1000 will still execute. I should still get the trade closing here, because the time range isn't affecting closing, but that second entry on the sell should not happen. Let me start that again. All right, so the buy has still happened at the same time in the same place, 1000 on the 20th of May. Now I'll run this forward to the point where that closes. And what I can see now is that trade closed, but there is no sell trade that has opened here. So the sell trade is outside the time range, and I can see that the time range is working. Now, if you're not using the framework, we can also create a simple standalone class that you can use for doing the same kind of checking. So I've already created the class here. I'm just calling it time range class C time range. I'll have the same private member variables, the start hour and minute and time and the end hour, minute and time. And I'm adding this Boolean valid range. This is to tell me whether the class has been initialized correctly or not. I'm not allowing here a variable to determine whether I'm checking if I'm inside or outside the range, because when you make the call to this class, it will tell you if the specified time is inside the range, and then you can simply apply a not to that in your call to determine if you want something outside. And then just to finish off the class definition, I've got a public constructor here that takes the start hour and minute, end hour and end minute, just as before. The destructor has no content and a single method called inside range. So now the constructor for this takes the 4 variables, and then I'm calculating this mValid range. Or remember, I created the variable up here. This will tell me whether the class has been initialized correctly. And by initialized correctly, I just mean that you've passed in valid values for hour, minute. So I've got all the same tests. The start hour has to be from 0 to 23, the end hour has to be from 0 to 23, the start minute from 0 to 59, and the end minute from 0 to 59. If all of those are correct, then mValid range will be true. If mValid range is not true, then I'm just displaying an error message. But if it is true, I'm capturing these input variables in the member variables and then calculating the start and the end time. So by start hour multiplied by 60 plus minute, end hour by 60 plus minute. They will both give me the number of minutes into the day for the start and the end time. And after that, the inside range function is the same, except that I have this one test here. If we're not in a valid range, so if this was not initialized correctly, if you passed in invalid values for hour or minute, then I'm simply going to return false from the inside range. As before, if the start and end times are the same, then it will always return true. Creating an MQL date time structure called MQL now, capturing the current time in that from the server, and then calculating the number of minutes by hours by 60 plus minutes. And then these are the same tests. If the start time is earlier than the end time, so I'm looking for a time range in the middle of the day, then now must be somewhere between start time and end time, and if it is, then it's valid. If the end time is earlier than the start time, so I'm looking at ranges that go from the end of one day into the beginning of the next, then now must be later than start time or earlier than the end time. And I'm just returning that value. So that's a complete working time range class, very similar to the functions that we had in the signal time range, but because I'm not treating this as a signal as part of the framework, I don't need to set the trade methods coming out of this. It's just going to return a Boolean value by calling this inside range. And if you wanted to, you can simply take this function and turn it into a callable function anywhere. I just find it convenient to have this as a class, because then I can set the start and end times once and just keep calling this as I need it. Now I've opened up the MetaTrader 5 editor, MQ5 here, just to show that the work that we've done is compatible and can be used on MQ4 or MQ5. So first I have the MA crossover time range MQ5. If I compile that, then that's successful. So all the code that we have in the MQ5 and the MQH is compatible with MT5. And then if I just go to the time range class, compile that, that's also compatible. So that same code will work in MT4 or MT5. That's everything for this video on implementing time ranges. If you found this useful, please click the like button, and if you want to see more videos like these, then click subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified when new videos are released. Thank you for watching.